Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of familial bonds shattered by obsession and violence. This is the story of the Papin sisters. A tale of love turned sinister, secrets buried under smiles, and a rivalry that escalated into unspeakable acts. This case will leave you asking, how far can loyalty bend before it breaks? And what happens when the people closest to you become your greatest threat? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of the Papin sisters. The Papin sisters, Elise and Juliet, were born into a family rife with dysfunction and quiet despair. Set in the picturesque but somber town of Cranbrook, their childhood was one of contradiction, scenic surroundings masking the grim reality of their home life. Their mother, Claire, was a stern and demanding woman, while their father, Maurice, was a drifter, spending more time away than with his family. Left to fend for themselves emotionally, Elise and Juliet clung to each other, forming a bond so intense it became their world. From a young age, it was clear that Elise, the elder by 3 years, was the dominant one. She was sharp, resourceful, and unflinchingly ambitious. In contrast, Juliet was quieter and more sensitive, her shy demeanor often earning her Elise's scorn. Elise viewed Juliet as both a protege and a pawn, someone she could mold to her will. And Juliet, desperate for approval, allowed herself to be led. The Papin household was a place of strict rules and harsh punishments. Claire believed in tough love, though the love part was seldom evident. Disobedience was met with severe consequences, often inflicted on Juliet, whom Claire saw as weaker and more in need of discipline. Elise, on the other hand, learned to navigate the household with cunning, always ensuring she stayed in her mother's good graces. As they grew older, their differences became more pronounced. Elise's ambition transformed into arrogance. She excelled in school, earning praise from teachers and peers, but her successes often came at a cost to others. She had a knack for finding weaknesses in people and using them to her advantage. Juliet, meanwhile, struggled academically and socially, often overshadowed by her sister's achievements. Despite their contrasting personalities, the sisters shared a love for small, mischievous adventures. They would sneak out late at night to explore the nearby woods or steal apples from the neighbor's orchard. It was during one of these escapades that Elise introduced Juliet to her darker tendencies. One summer evening, Elise suggested they steal small trinkets from a local market. Juliet hesitated, her instinct warning her against the idea, but Elise was persuasive, framing the theft as a harmless game and a chance to prove herself. "No one will notice," Elise whispered. "It's just for fun. Don't you want to do something exciting for once?" Reluctantly, Juliet agreed. At first, the thrill of getting away with their petty crime was intoxicating. But the excitement quickly turned to dread when Juliet was caught pocketing a hairpin by the shopkeeper, an old man with a sharp eye. Elise, standing nearby, pretended to know nothing, slipping away before anyone could question her. The humiliation of being scolded and marched home by the shopkeeper was unbearable for Juliet. Yet what stung more was Elise's betrayal. When Claire found out, she was furious, grounding Juliet for weeks and forcing her to return the stolen item with an apology. Elise, meanwhile, escaped punishment entirely. Juliet's trust in her sister was shaken, but not broken. Elise, ever the charmer, managed to smooth things over, convincing Juliet that it was all a misunderstanding. She promised to make it up to her, and Juliet, desperate to believe in their bond, forgave her. But cracks in their relationship began to form. Juliet started noticing patterns, how Elise always seemed to come out unscathed while others bore the consequences of her schemes. There were whispers among their peers about Elise's manipulative streak. A classmate recalled how Elise had once orchestrated a prank that left another girl humiliated, only to feign innocence when confronted. As they entered their teenage years, Elise's ambitions grew bolder. She began dreaming of leaving Cranbrook, envisioning a life of wealth and success far removed from their humble beginnings. Juliet, however, found herself tethered to the town, unable to imagine a future beyond its borders. Their mother's health began to decline during this time, adding more strain to their lives. With Maurice still absent, the responsibility of caring for Claire fell primarily on Juliet. Elise, true to form, avoided the burden, claiming she was too busy with her studies and social commitments. One night, Juliet overheard a conversation between Elise and one of her friends. Elise laughed as she recounted the market incident, describing Juliet as too soft for her own good. Juliet's heart sank. For the first time, she realized the depth of Elise's selfishness. Yet, despite everything, Juliet remained loyal. She convinced herself that Elise's actions stemmed from their harsh upbringing, that beneath her tough exterior, Elise cared for her in her own way. But deep down, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that her sister's love was conditional, tied to her usefulness. The final straw came when their mother passed away. At the funeral, Elise's behavior was cold and detached, her focus already on leaving Cranbrook. Within weeks, she announced her plans to move to the city, leaving Juliet behind to deal with the remnants of their fractured family. As Elise boarded the train, Juliet stood on the platform, torn between resentment and sadness. She watched her sister disappear into the distance, feeling a mix of relief and loss. For the first time, she was alone, free from Elise's shadow, yet weighed down by the scars of their relationship. Little did Juliet know, this was only the beginning. Their paths would cross again, and when they did, the bond they once shared would unravel in ways far darker than she could ever imagine. 5 years passed after Elise left Cranbrook, and the Papin sisters found themselves living vastly different lives. Elise thrived in the bustling city, working as a live-in maid for the wealthy Latter family. Her intelligence and charm had earned her their trust, and she quickly became indispensable. Meanwhile, Juliet remained in Cranbrook, drifting between odd jobs and feeling the weight of her loneliness. But life in the city wasn't as perfect as Elise made it seem in her occasional letters to Juliet. Beneath her polished facade, Elise harbored resentment. She despised the Latters for their wealth, seeing them as a symbol of everything she believed she deserved but had been denied. When Elise wrote to Juliet asking her to move to the city and join her at the Latter estate, Juliet hesitated. She hadn't heard from Elise in months and was wary of her sister's motives, but the promise of a fresh start away from the stifling familiarity of Cranbrook was too tempting to ignore. When Juliet arrived, she was struck by the grandeur of the Latter mansion. The sprawling estate, with its marble floors and ornate chandeliers, was a world apart from the modest home they had grown up in. But there was an unspoken tension that hung over the household. Madame Latour, the matriarch, was exacting and cold, while her teenage daughter, Sophie, treated the maids with thinly veiled disdain. Elise, however, seemed unfazed. She had carved out a position of authority among the staff, directing the other maids with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Juliet noticed the way Elise spoke about the Latters when they weren't around, her voice laced with bitterness. "They think they're better than us," Elise would mutter, her eyes narrowing. "But they're nothing without people like us keeping their lives together." At first, Juliet tried to focus on her work and avoid getting involved in Elise's schemes, but it wasn't long before Elise began pulling her back into her web. Late one night, Elise shared her plan. They would rob the Latters and disappear before anyone could suspect them. Juliet was horrified. "Elise, no," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't like stealing a hairpin from a market. This is dangerous." But Elise was relentless, painting the Latters as villains who deserved to be taken down. "Do you think they care about us, Juliet? Do you think they even see us as people?" She snapped. "We've spent our lives scraping by while they sit in luxury. Don't you think it's time we took what we're owed?" Despite her misgivings, Juliet found herself drawn into Elise's plan. She had always struggled to say no to her sister, and part of her still yearned for the bond they had shared as children. The night of the robbery, a storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the darkened halls of the mansion. Elise led the way, her movements precise and calculated. Juliet trailed behind, her hands trembling as they searched for valuables. They thought they were alone, but as they rifled through drawers in Madame Latour's bedroom, they heard the sound of the front door slamming. Madame Latour and Sophie had returned early from their evening out. Panic set in. "Hide," Elise hissed, dragging Juliet into the shadows. But Madame Latour entered the room before they could escape. What happened next would haunt Juliet for the rest of her life. Elise lunged at Madame Latour with a fury Juliet had never seen before. Grabbing a heavy candlestick, Elise struck her repeatedly, her face contorted with rage. "Sophie," hearing the commotion, ran into the room and screamed, only to meet the same fate. Juliet stood frozen, her mind racing. She wanted to stop Elise, to scream for help, but her body refused to move. When it was over, the room was silent, except for the sound of Elise's labored breathing. The two bodies lay motionless on the floor, the once pristine room now splattered with blood. Elise turned to Juliet, her expression eerily calm. "Help me clean this up," she said. Juliet's hands shook as she obeyed, her mind a blur of fear and disbelief. Together, they tried to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. But in their haste, they left behind clues: footprints, a torn piece of Elise's apron, and a half-filled bag of stolen jewelry. The next morning, the police arrived. The latter staff was questioned, and it didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Elise and Juliet. Elise maintained her composure, deflecting questions with ease. Juliet, however, crumbled under the pressure, her guilt written across her face. When the police found the stolen jewelry hidden in Elise's quarters, the sisters were arrested. The news of the murders spread quickly, and Cranbrook was shocked to learn that their once promising daughters had been involved in such a gruesome crime. The trial that followed would uncover dark secrets about the Papin sisters' relationship, secrets that would forever tarnish their legacy. But in that moment, as they were led away in handcuffs, Juliet couldn't stop replaying the events of the night in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder, had Elise planned the murders all along? Or had something inside her sister snapped, transforming her into the monster Juliet had always feared she could become? Unbeknownst to her, the answers to those questions would soon come to light, and they would be far more chilling than Juliet could ever imagine. The Papin sisters' arrest sent shockwaves through the community, and the trial quickly became a media spectacle. The brutal murders of Madame Lauder and her daughter Sophie were not just a tragedy, they were a scandal that unearthed dark secrets about the Papin sisters' lives and their complex, unsettling bond. In the days leading up to the trial, Elise and Juliet were kept in separate cells, their fates now entangled yet precariously apart. Juliet's mind was a storm of fear and regret. Her sister's influence had once seemed unshakable, but now, faced with the cold reality of their crimes, Juliet felt the weight of her own complicity. Elise, in stark contrast, remained unnervingly composed. Even in custody, she exuded a calm authority, a stark reminder of the control she had wielded over Juliet for so many years. But beneath the surface, Elise was calculating. She knew the case against them was strong. Physical evidence tied them to the crime scene, and their motives, though murky, were evident. Elise needed a plan, and in her mind there was only one way out: sacrifice Juliet to save herself. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists jostled for seats, eager to capture every twist and turn of what had been dubbed the Cranbrook murders. The prosecution painted Elise as a manipulative and vengeful woman, driven by jealousy and greed. Juliet, they argued, was the weaker sister, a follower ensnared by her siblings' influence. But the defense had a different narrative. Elise's lawyer portrayed her as a victim of circumstance, a young woman trapped in a toxic household and subjected to a life of servitude that had broken her spirit. They claimed the murders were not premeditated but a moment of blind rage born out of years of mistreatment by the latters. Juliet's lawyer, however, took a different approach. He argued that Juliet had been coerced into the crime, her actions a direct result of Elise's manipulative control. To illustrate this, the defense delved into the sisters' childhood, painting a bleak picture of their upbringing. As witnesses took the stand, details of the Papin family's dysfunction spilled into the open. Neighbors spoke of the harsh punishments Claire Papin inflicted on her daughters, often singling out Juliet for her perceived weakness. Former classmates described Elise's cunning nature, recounting how she had a knack for turning people against each other, while remaining above suspicion. But the most damning testimony came from Elise herself. When she took the stand, her performance was chillingly convincing. With a calm and measured tone, she admitted to stealing from the Laters, but denied having any intention of harming them. Instead, she pointed the finger at Juliet, claiming her sister had snapped under pressure and lashed out in a fit of uncontrollable rage. She was always fragile, Elise said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. I tried to stop her, but it was too late. I didn't know what else to do, so I helped her clean up. She's my sister, and I couldn't abandon her. The courtroom buzzed with shock. Juliet, sitting a few feet away, felt as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Elise's betrayal was complete. The sister she had trusted, even in the darkest moments, had turned against her to save herself. Juliet's lawyer fought back, presenting evidence that contradicted Elise's story. The placement of the bodies, the injuries inflicted, and the timeline of events all pointed to Elise as the mastermind. But Elise's composure and eloquence cast a shadow of doubt over the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Juliet grew increasingly isolated. The public, swayed by Elise's testimony, began to see Juliet as the true villain. Headlines labeled her a killer in disguise, while Elise was framed as a tragic figure who had been dragged in a nightmare. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Both sisters faced the possibility of life in prison, but their fates now rested in the hands of the jury. When the verdict was announced, the room fell silent. Elise was found guilty of second-degree murder, her punishment reduced by the court's belief in her claim of being an unwilling accomplice. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Juliet, however, was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury believed Elise's narrative that Juliet had been the one to strike the fatal blows, driven by uncontrollable rage. She was sentenced to life without parole. As Juliet was led out of the courtroom, her mind reeled. How had it come to this? She had spent her life trying to please Elise, to earn her approval, only to be betrayed in the end. Elise, watching her sister disappear through the courtroom doors, felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it guilt, or merely relief? For all her cunning, Elise couldn't escape the truth entirely. She had won her freedom, but the cost was her sister's life and whatever remained of her own humanity. But the story didn't end there. As Juliet sat in her cell, cut off from the outside world, she began to piece together the events that had led to her downfall. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized there were pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of her mind, a question began to form, a question that would haunt her every waking moment. What if Elise's betrayal wasn't just about self-preservation? What if it was all part of a plan she'd orchestrated from the very beginning? For Juliet, the nightmare was far from over. Juliet's first days in prison were a blur of despair and disbelief. The cold, unyielding walls of her cell felt like a physical manifestation of her shattered life. She couldn't shake the weight of Elise's betrayal, replaying the trial in her mind like a broken record. Elise's calm, calculating performance on the stand haunted her, the echoes of her sister's damning testimony refusing to fade. For years, Juliet had lived in Elise's shadow, bending to her will, believing that their bond, however flawed, was unbreakable. Now she was alone, carrying the blame for a crime she hadn't truly committed. But as the days turned into weeks, a new emotion began to replace her grief: anger. The anger came in waves, washing over her in quiet moments when the world outside her cell seemed far away. At first it was directed inward. She berated herself for trusting Elise, for following her into a life of deceit. But soon, that anger found its rightful target. Elise had manipulated her, used her, and discarded her when it was convenient. As Juliet adjusted to life in prison, she began to notice something peculiar. Among the inmates and guards, whispers followed her wherever she went. The story of the Papin sisters had captured the public's imagination, and within the prison walls, Juliet had become a reluctant celebrity. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer. Others viewed her as a tragic figure, a pawn in Elise's game. One day, Juliet received an unexpected visitor, a journalist named Claire DuPont. Claire had followed the trial closely and was unconvinced by the official narrative. She believed there was more to the story's secrets hidden beneath the surface that could change everything. "I want to tell your side of the story," Claire said, her voice steady but earnest. "The truth deserves to be heard." At first, Juliet was skeptical. She had been burned too many times by trust, and the thought of reopening old wounds terrified her. But as Claire continued to visit, Juliet found herself opening up. She recounted her childhood, the toxic environment they had endured, and the subtle yet relentless way Elise had controlled her life. As Juliet spoke, Claire began to piece together a narrative far more sinister than the one presented in court. Elise wasn't just manipulative, she was calculating, ruthless, and driven by a desire for power and wealth at any cost. The latter murders, Claire suspected, had been Elise's plan from the beginning, a scheme designed to rid herself of the family she despised while escaping unscathed. But proving Elise's true intentions was another matter entirely. Claire began digging into the latter family's history, hoping to uncover a motive stronger than the vague claims of mistreatment presented at trial. What she found was startling. Madame Lauder had recently updated her will, leaving a significant sum of money to Elise as a reward for her dedicated service. This change had been made just weeks before the murders, and the timing was suspicious. Even more damning, Claire discovered that Elise had been in contact with a lawyer about her inheritance shortly after the murders, a detail that hadn't come up during the trial. Armed with this information, Claire confronted Elise during a public interview she had secured under the guise of discussing her rehabilitation. Elise, always composed, initially brushed off the questions with her trademark charm. But when Claire mentioned the will, a flicker of unease crossed her face. "Elise," Claire pressed, "did you know about the changes to Madame Lauder's will before the murders?" Elise's answer was a carefully measured denial, but Claire could see the cracks in her facade. The journalist's persistence rattled her, and Elise abruptly ended the interview, citing unfair treatment. Meanwhile, Juliet began to sense a shift. Claire's visits brought a glimmer of hope, a possibility that her story might finally be heard. But with hope came fear. Elise had always been one step ahead, and Juliet knew her sister wouldn't go down without a fight. Her fears were confirmed when she received a letter from Elise. The envelope, marked with her sister's familiar handwriting, sent a chill down Juliet's spine. In the letter, Elise maintained her innocence, blaming Claire for stirring up trouble. But beneath the surface, her words carried an unspoken threat. "Don't forget where your loyalty lies," Elise wrote. "We've been through too much for you to turn against me now." For Juliet, the letter was a wake-up call. Elise wasn't just trying to protect herself, she was trying to silence her sister, to ensure that the truth remained buried. Claire, undeterred by Elise's evasions, continued her investigation. She uncovered testimonies from former staff members at the Lauder estate, many of whom described Elise's growing resentment toward the family. One maid even claimed that Elise had spoken openly about getting what she was owed, though she hadn't taken the comments seriously at the time. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Claire prepared to publish her findings, a scathing expose that would reveal Elise's true nature to the world. But as the deadline approached, strange things began to happen. Claire's apartment was broken into, her notes ransacked, but nothing else stolen. Anonymous phone calls warned her to let sleeping dogs lie. And one evening, as she walked home from her office, she noticed a shadowy figure following her. The story was becoming more dangerous than Claire had anticipated. But she wasn't about to back down, not when the truth was so close to being uncovered. For Juliet, each passing day brought a mix of hope and dread. Would Claire's investigation finally expose Elise's lies? Or would her sister find a way to slip through the cracks once again, leaving Juliet to bear the burden of their shared sins? As the tension mounted, one thing became clear: the Papin sisters' story was far from over, and the revelations to come would be darker than anyone could have imagined. The tension that had been building for months finally reached a boiling point. Juliet sat in her prison cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, unable to shake the feeling that everything was closing in on her. Elise had always been the one in control, but now, as her sister's manipulations began to unravel, Juliet could sense that the endgame was approaching. The truth about the murders, long buried beneath lies and deceit, was about to surface. For months, Claire Dupont had been working tirelessly to uncover the real story behind the latter murders, and with each passing day she found herself closer to the truth. The more she dug into Elise's past, the more the puzzle pieces fell into place. She had discovered that Elise had been planning the murders for weeks before they occurred. The updated will, the strange behavior of the latter family, and Elise's interactions with a lawyer were all part of a carefully crafted scheme to inherit Madame Latour's wealth. Claire's investigation had already led to a dramatic shift in public perception. Where once the world had seen Juliet as the killer, the evidence now pointed to Elise as the true mastermind. The tide was turning, but Elise wasn't going to give up without a fight. Juliet had been watching from afar as the media began to change its narrative. Stories started circulating about Elise's possible involvement in the murders, with experts and analysts arguing that Juliet had been framed. But the more Juliet heard, the more she questioned whether she had been a mere pawn in Elise's grand design. Then, one morning, Juliet received an unexpected visit. It was Claire again, this time holding a thick manila envelope. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and Juliet's heart skipped a beat. "I've got something," Claire said, breathless. "It's not just speculation anymore. We have undeniable proof." Inside the envelope were documents, letters, bank statements, and even pieces of evidence that tied Elise directly to the murders. Claire had discovered that Elise had been in regular contact with a private investigator in the months before the killings, gathering information on Madame Lauder's estate and her financial situation. There were also phone records showing that Elise had been in contact with her lawyer just days after the murder, discussing the inheritance and her new role as a potential beneficiary. The final blow came in the form of a confession. Claire had managed to track down a former employee of the Lauder family, a woman who had worked as a housekeeper for years. She had overheard a conversation between Elise and Madame Lauder in which Elise had expressed her desire to claim what was rightfully hers. The woman had never come forward, fearing retaliation, but now, with the mounting pressure of Claire's investigation, she had decided to tell the truth. With this new evidence, Claire's expose was complete. The article detailing Elise's manipulation, her cold, calculating nature, and her role in the murders was set to be published in a major newspaper. It would be the final nail in the coffin for Elise's carefully constructed story. As the day of the publication approached, Juliet sat in her cell, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. The truth was about to come out, but what would it mean for her? Would she be exonerated, or would the revelations about Elise tear apart everything Juliet had known? The answer came sooner than Juliet expected. That evening, just as she was preparing for bed, a prison guard came to her cell and handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in Elise's unmistakable handwriting. "Congratulations, Juliet," the letter read. "It seems the truth is finally being exposed. But don't think for a moment that you've won. The real story is still ours to tell. And remember, no one will ever believe you, not after everything you've done. No one will care about your side of the story. You'll always be the killer, the one who took everything from me. I'll make sure of it." The letter was a chilling reminder that Elise's influence was far from over. Even as the world began to turn on her, Elise was still playing her games, still manipulating from afar. Juliet's heart sank. She was no longer just a victim of the murder. She had become a victim of Elise's relentless control. But this time, Juliet wasn't going to let her sister win. The truth had been exposed, and the public would finally see Elise for who she truly was, a cold, calculating murderer. For the first time in her life, Juliet felt a spark of hope. The pieces of her past were falling into place, and no matter how hard Elise tried to twist the narrative, the truth was out. The battle between the sisters had reached its conclusion, but the scars it left would never fade. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. Stories like the Papin sisters remind us of the dark complexities of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked manipulation. What do you think drove Juliet to remain loyal to Elias until the very end? And do you believe some bonds are too strong to break, no matter the cost? Let us know in the comments. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.